Hey there, and welcome to the ECM Podcast. I'm Friedrich Kunzmann, and I'm happy to be hosting this newest episode of the podcast and take you behind the scenes of new music on ECM Records. For this episode, I got together with German-American pianist Benjamin Lackner, whose newest album, called Last Decade, was just released. It's Benjamin's debut album for ECM, as well as the first of the specific lineup, with Jérôme Regard on bass, Mathias Eick on trumpet, and drummer Manu Katché. In our conversation, Benjamin talks about the recording session for the album at Studios La Buissonne, about his past 10 years and why they ended up being the record's title. He talks about studying with his teachers Charlie Haden and Brad Mehldau, as well as about what it's like to work with this specific group and the groove that they bring. Hi, Benjamin.
Hi, how are you doing?
Glad you could join us for this podcast.
Me too, man. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
I'd like to get started right away with your new album called Last Decade.
Yes.
What does this title mean to you? How does this collection of music reflect the title?
For me, it's basically a representation of all the good and bad that's happened in the last 10 years. And it's kind of a still picture of the last 10 years because I've had so many life-changing events happen in the last 10 years, and every song is dedicated to a different sort of piece of those last 10 years.
Could you give us an example of which piece might represent for you? I mean, there's Last Decade, the title track, which is, of course, the whole of it.
Yeah.
But then there's also the opener, Where Do We Go From Here?
The opening to, Where Do We Go From Here? It's kind of it was conceived as the last track of the album, which was meant as a after view of where do we go from here after everything was played. But then in the order of events, it turned into a beautiful opener for the album. And it's kind of a question I asked myself after every bigger incident in life. Where do we go from here? And it's kind of a moment of collecting yourself and being open to wherever things take me.
And when you say that, Last Decade, it summarizes everything that's happened to you, but also all the good and the bad. Does that also mean that it kind of reflects what happened outside of your own world, but what happened politically in the political landscapes, all of the crises we've gone through, and that's part of it.
And also learning how to function aside from what's happening outside. And like I work in this space alone every day, probably 30 hours a week, and I used to rely on feeling good from the outside.
Yeah.
So, now you have family members getting older and chaos in the world, and I need a constant positive energy from within actually to function because I work alone so much. I come to this place like 6 hours a day. And
you're in your studio in Berlin right now.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. And my routine is actually composing and recording and practicing alone, and in a way, you have to be self-reliant and kind of learn how to separate issues from the outside world.
Yeah, you have to go on despite of it all.
Exactly. Yeah.
Kind of, yeah.
And then somehow the outside world incorporates itself into my music, obviously. You can't separate the two.
Nice. And your connection with Jérôme Regard, your bassist on this record, is a more obvious one because he's been part of your long-standing trio since 2006.
Yep.
The other musicians on this album, however, are new to your family of collaborators. Mm-hmm. How did your and Mathias Eick's and Manu Katché's paths cross?
That was interesting, actually. Manu Katché saw my trio with Jérôme and Mathieu play in Viersen Jazz Festival about 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. And he kind of remembered that He mentioned that to me a couple months ago. And Jérôme and I met up with Manu in Berlin, and we had this mutual idea of doing an album. And since I already have this trio for the last 15 years, we were thinking of who would be a good horn player. And I saw Mathias Eick play live in Bremen, and he moved me to tears, literally. Like, really, I hadn't been moved by a live concert in a long time like that. And we contacted him, and he immediately said yes. Pretty amazing.
Great.
Pretty astounding.
And they're both deeply connected to the ECM label in the past decades, with several leader dates each. And they even played together on Katché's second album for ECM, Playground.
Yeah, Playground.
How aware were you of their respective work before the session, and did it influence your writing for it?
That's a good question. I was totally aware of both of their albums and their connection to ECM. And my melodic phrasing, the way I was thinking of it, had Mathias in mind once he agreed for the project. And obviously Manu's drumming was in there somewhere as well. I was building demos to make it sound a little bit towards that, his feel. And I was totally writing for this specific personnel, yeah. And then what happened was we started sending music back and forth during the pandemic, and Mathias would record some of the heads and send them back, and it just made instant sense.
It's true that there's a striking lyrical and very immediate melodic quality to the compositions on Last Decade. And in that respect, the music also, it differs from a lot of the things you've been doing with your trio.
Yep.
Was it hard to kind of give away a lot of those melodic lines, a lot of the leads, since normally you're solely in charge of that?
Not in this case, because he played them the way I was hearing them, or even better, actually. And he made the contours of the dynamic shape of each phrase. He got the most out of every phrase, I'm serious, for my taste.
A big part of that is sustain, I feel. There's a certain quality to Mathias' sustain, of course, to the sustain of the trumpet that can't be compared to that of the piano. And
also the dynamic range within the lines. Like he would specifically go so low at certain moments right after I was going high, and it really
low as in frequency, not in
in frequency.
Okay.
and well, in range as well sometimes.
Yeah,
but he would just adapt always to something that would make sense in the moment. But yes, it was different not being the lead singer, so to speak. So I ended up actually having to learn my own harmony lines to the main. Like I would transpose and write counter lines and then double them with Mathias, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, because I mean, he's not even the only one who has the leading phrases.
Right.
In the trumpet, because sometimes it kind of goes through different instruments. It can go into Jérôme's bass, and so forth. When you were finally in the studio with Manfred Eicher in Studios La Buissonne, that was last year in September
4th.
September 2021.
Yeah.
Would you say the music came together as you'd planned, or were there unexpected twists that changed the outcome of your respective tunes? Maybe spontaneous strokes of genius by your respective instrumental colleagues?
Oh, yeah. It was actually much more rigid when I first had the material, because obviously I also used tracking and there was no spontaneous dealing with each other. So once we were in the studio, everything... I'm so happy with this recording because it seems so organic, and the conversation we're having musically is so unforced. And
Yeah.
it turned out even much more that way than I would have hoped, you know. And the demo was pretty. It was just kind of like a blueprint of what could happen with this material, and
Okay.
yeah, it definitely changed a huge amount. And then through Manfred's input, it changed also, because he would shape even some of the way we were soloing on the stuff, just by making us listen back to it and finding the right path for this particular song.
And it seems like, you know, every instrumentalist, every artist on this record has something to give to the respective tunes, as in Manu Katché's specific drum work, which is very, I would call it beat concentric. There's always some undercurrent of a groove going on that's not typically swinging, but more in the groove repertoire.
Yep.
Would you say that is something that happened in the studio, or is it something you prescribed?
I mean, actually, I feel like he plays groove and backbeat, but he also opens up to more of a straight eighth type vibe.
Mm-hmm.
Like a backbeat can sometimes be too boxy.
Sometimes he gets rubato-esque. Sometimes it definitely opens up. It's never constricted to a strict pulse. It's a natural pulse. Yeah.
And it also changes throughout each song, where you could have some funk drummer just keep a beat, and then there's a fine line where it could turn corny, you know what I mean? If it doesn't, but Manu let the music breathe, and it would just open up and go somewhere else, yeah. But I never gave him that many directions. No, he did that intuitively, actually. We did cut out some beat ideas that were too conceptual for him. Like I noticed I spent too much time alone preparing for this album without getting his feedback. So I came into the studio with a bunch of polyrhythmic stuff that was too cerebral. It didn't feel good. Yeah. So then we just changed the beats to, like, his main concern is to make everyone feel good.
Some of the harmonic work, I assume that was composed prior. The harmonic outlines and sketches of each track were not improvised on the spot.
Yeah, that's completely written, except the bass song. Jérôme wrote track number 8,
which is an improvisation on the spot, right? Yeah,
dedicated to his son. Yeah, but no, I spent. Because the session got moved by a year because of the pandemic, I have never spent so much time composing for one record.
Mm-hmm.
And actually now I'm in this routine, and I've written 40 songs since that session, just because I'm so used to writing every day.
Yeah,
which is great. Yeah,
that's beautiful. Yeah. That means you have enough stuff to sift through for the next session.
Yep.
Would you like to talk about some of the individual tracks and their meanings on this record?
Yeah, one that's kind of dear to me because it's a tribute to my grandparents. It's called Camino Cielo, and that one changed a humongous amount in the studio. I brought it in as a ballad, and actually Matthias cut it in half and said, can you just try comping on the offbeat? And then it turned into this beautiful forward-moving thing rather than a sluggish ballad. So that got changed completely. And my grandparents were really supportive of the arts, and they're kind of the reason I'm actually able to do what I'm doing. And I wanted to pay tribute in a way. And this mountain range, Camino Cielo, is behind where they used to live in California.
In California, which is also where you grew up for a large part of your life.
Yeah, I moved there. Yeah, my father's American, my mom's German. And I moved to California at the age of 12. And had a great jazz teacher and studied with Charlie Haden and got right into the jazz thing because I moved to California. I think it would have happened much later in Germany at the time.
Mehldau as well was one of your teachers.
Right.
After school, you also studied in the States before moving back to Europe.
I got my BFA at CalArts, and then I moved to New York and lived and played there for 10 years.
And when did you move to Berlin?
In 2008, I moved back.
2008.
Yeah.
Those landscapes, those jazz landscapes between the States and Europe, it's a whole nother thing, a whole nother vibe.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
Yeah.
Please.
What comes to mind is that I feel like I musically was not able to find myself until I left New York, because I had more space in Berlin, because just the way the scene works in New York, I was trying to play all the time, learning music for other people, trying to make a living, and you don't even have time to I was also much younger, but you don't have time to reflect as much. And my idea,
because you're constantly hustling.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah.
And you're trying to keep up with the next pianist that's coming along, and I felt like moving to Berlin was a huge part of having the time to really focus on writing and figuring out what is it that I actually want to say on the piano. Yeah, and not even worrying about what the other people are doing.
That was Benjamin Lackner talking about his new ECM record, Last Decade. Thank you for joining me in the ECM Podcast. I'm Friedrich Kunzmann, and I'm looking forward to sharing more new music with you very soon.